And now a little about our presenter. Zach is a gardener in the collections team at the USBG. At the garden, Zach maintains our diverse collection of carnivorous plants. And at home, Zach is an avid plant enthusiast, growing over 200 plants, including orchids, aroids, and carnivorous plants. Welcome, Zach.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Zach. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do at the garden?
Yeah, so I am a gardener on the collections team. My primary assignment is the carnivorous plant collection, and I'm very lucky and grateful to be growing the carnivorous plant collection. Carnivorous plants are one of my favorite things in the entire world. Along with the carnivorous plants, I grow about a third of our orchid collection, mostly our cymbidium and our cattleyas, but I kind of float around and help where needed. But I really enjoy what I do. I love the plants that I work with, and I'm very grateful to work with plants I love so much.
Awesome. You've pulled together some great photos for us. Can you tell us a little bit more about the carnivorous plant collections at the BG?
Yeah, so we have a few hundred carnivorous plants at the Botanic Garden, and they're divided into 3 climate zones. We have North American temperate carnivorous plants, a Nepenthe zone with tropical plants, as well as some of our heat and humidity loving Australian sundews in the Petiolaris complex. And there is also a collection of carnivorous plants in that range from warm temperate climate zones in Australia and other places in the world. And those are grown in a separate greenhouse as well. And it's kind of a mix of plants there. But on the left, you can see, if we go back, on the left, you can see that mixed greenhouse. In the middle, those are our Nepenthes and the heat-loving plants. And on the right are the cold temperate plants. And if you go to the next photo, just an example from each of those collections. On the left is the Venus flytrap, a very charismatic carnivorous plant. Most people would probably think of that one when they think of carnivorous. And in the middle is a Nepenthe, a tropical pitcher plant from Asia. And we have a Drosera, or a sundew, on the right side. And that one is actually from Australia, but sundews are from all over the world.
That's great. Thanks for telling us a little bit more about what we've got at the USBG, Zach. And do you have any, amongst all of these hundreds of carnivorous plants, do you have any favorites?
Well, if you ask anyone I work with, I call almost every plant my favorite plant. But I do have ones that I absolutely love growing. And if you go to the next slide, this is the dewy pine, or Drosophilum lusitanicum, from Spain, actually. And this is a very cool plant that I love growing because it's interesting among carnivorous plants. Most are from really wet environments like bogs or rainforests. And this one is from a Mediterranean climate zone that's really dry, almost like a desert, but not quite. And it grows among the Mediterranean heathlands with Calluna vulgaris and a bunch of other plants. And it's quite interesting because it stays super dewy, even though it lives in these dry conditions. And it really looks like a sundew, but it's not really related to them. It's actually more closely related to the Nepenthes, or tropical pitcher plants. And I really love being able to grow this plant. I have a couple that I'm trying to start from seed to display in our Mediterranean house because it's kind of an overlap with that collection. But I'm excited to hopefully get those out to the public soon.
Wow, thank you, Zach. That is so cool that these are more closely related to Nepenthes. I had no idea.
Yeah, they don't look like it, but they are.
No, not at all. One more question is, how did you get started growing carnivorous plants?
I started growing carnivorous plants a very long time ago. The earliest memory I have of doing it is in preschool. I remember my preschool teacher brought out a book on carnivorous plants, and I was so fascinated, and I went home and I begged my parents to order me a Venus flytrap. And I grew up in a time where ordering plants online was very common, and I would save up my money and my quarters, and I'd send them in an envelope to all these different websites and order plants in. And by middle school, I had a huge collection of plants. I had a bunch of temperate plants outside, and I had a terrarium in my bedroom with Nepenthes and other tropical plants. And even though I work with plants and at work, I still do have quite a few plants. Before I started here, I did have around 200 at home. It's much fewer now. I've donated some to the garden and I've given away some to friends, but I still do have a collection of Nepenthes at home. And it's great to have been growing these plants for so long, and being able to do it now as a career and show it to the public is even better.
Thanks, Zach. And if folks were able to visit the garden, where might they find some carnivorous plants if they came to us for a visit?
Right now, we have 2 areas where carnivorous plants are on display. The first being the Adaptations House. There's a dish garden of cold and warm temperate plants from North America and Australia, as well as another dish garden with some South American pitcher plants and sundews. And you can find those in our adaptation room again. There's also a bog in Bartholdi Park with some Sarracenia and sundews. So I would definitely head out there and try and see those. And we're actually planning, this is not open to the public yet, but it will be in the coming year. There's a bog that's going to be installed in Southern Exposure, where I'm standing right now, with these beautiful Silphium and Veronia, the fall colors. It's so nice. But we'll be installing a bog right in front of these that will be filled with southern North American carnivorous plants. And those will be installed sometime in the coming year. Me and the North American the Mid-Atlantic plant specialist will actually be heading down to the Carolinas to do a collection trip in a bog, and we're hoping to collect a lot of species from the wild that we'll be able to display and show you in our Southern Exposure. So keep an ear and an eye open for that.
That is so exciting. Definitely something to look forward to. So now we'll open it up to audience questions. We already have a few rolling in. So for our audience this morning, feel free to keep those questions coming. We'll start with, we've got a question here about Venus flytraps. The question is, our Venus flytraps die a little more every time we water them. What is going on?
Well, that could be a lot of things. Depending on how they're dying too, whether the leaves are blackening from the tip or the whole plant is rotting, would help. But to give a general overview of that, the first thing I should mention is most carnivorous plants are adapted to environments where there's very few nutrients in the soil and the water. So you have to make sure you're watering your carnivorous plants with either rainwater or distilled water. And a lot of people say never use tap water, but that's kind of a generalization. If you get a dissolved solid meter and you test your tap water and it's very close to 0 total dissolved solids, and there are places in the United States where it's like that, you can actually water them with your tap water, but you have to make sure that it's very low in dissolved solids. So that's the first thing I would say. If you're not using distilled or rainwater, or you haven't tested your tap water, that would be the first thing that would come to mind. If you are using distilled or rainwater and you've sorted out that problem, the plant, depending on where it's growing, they're going to want more water. If they have more light, most people will say sit them in a dish of water, and that's generally true. I tend to grow my Venus flytraps sitting in at least an inch of water at all times, except in the winter when I keep them a bit drier. Still moist, but a bit drier than that. And if you're giving them too much water and they're not getting enough sun, they will tend to rot out on you. These plants really like full sun, and if you're not giving them full sun and you're giving them a lot of water, they can tend to rot. So I would troubleshoot there, but I hope that helps.
That's great. Thank you, Zach. And we've got a related Venus flytrap question, which is, we have someone who is keeping their Venus flytraps on their outside porch, and they're wondering what they should do with them in the winter. Should they bring them inside or leave them out? And these folks live in Maryland.
Well, that depends. That's always gardening. There's never an exact answer, but Venus flytraps are cold hardy plants, and they're native to North and South Carolina. So if you can imagine, it still gets pretty cold there. And here at the Botanic Garden, I grow Venus flytraps in a greenhouse that gets quite cold in the winter, but I also grow some at home, and those do stay outside all year round. Generally, if you have temperatures that are not going into the 20s for an extended period of time, you can leave your Venus flytraps outside and just keep them slightly moist. You don't want them sitting in water in the winter, but you still want them damp. So I used to live in an apartment, and I would have my Venus flytraps sitting on a 6-story balcony all year long. They got quite a bit of sun in the winter. They were southern exposure, so it stayed quite warm on that balcony. So I would kind of gauge that if that area stays warmer, you can probably leave them outside all year and not really have to worry about them. But if you notice that it's a shadier spot or it's getting colder in the winter, you might want to put them in a garage or bring them inside if it's going to be in the 20s for more than a few days.
Thanks, Zach. And we have a related question. For temperate plants, do you want to move the plants to a cooler place so that they go into dormancy? And maybe talk a little bit about what dormancy might look like for some carnivorous plants?
Yeah, so there's quite a few temperate carnivorous plants, ranging from the North American ones like Venus flytraps and Sarracenia to the West Coast North American Darlingtonia. And there's even some Australian temperate plants and European temperate carnivorous plants as well. And those plants that are from regions that do get cold in the winter do need a dormancy, or they will not continue to grow for you in the long term. So generally, with carnivorous plants that require a cold dormancy, you want to move them to a place that stays just above freezing and doesn't freeze for extended period of time. So whether that be an unheated porch or a porch that stays a little bit warmer outside, that's where you would want to put these plants. Or even if you live in a house that has drafty windowsills, it might even be enough to leave the plant there, and it might induce dormancy. But dormancy looks different in all types of carnivorous plants. I'll start with Venus flytraps. Generally in the summer when they're actively growing, Venus flytraps are producing traps that are upright and in the air, but in the winter those traps will die back and they'll produce smaller traps that are kind of hugging the ground. They generally don't die all the way back. You should still see a bit of green, but if the plant does die all the way back, I wouldn't be too concerned. And it will just slow down growth. They'll still look alive. You might wonder why it looks a bit sad. You can take all the black leaves off and just keep them moist, and they'll come back for you in the spring. In terms of Sarracenia, depending on the species, some Sarracenia die all the way back. Some don't really die back at all, like Sarracenia purpurea or Sarracenia rosea and psittacina. The lower growing ones tend to keep most of their pitchers in the winter. The taller Sarracenia generally tend to brown off on the pitchers, and you can either cut the brown off or leave it till the spring. And in addition to that browning, you'll often see on species like Sarracenia leucophila, the white top pitcher plant, and Sarracenia aureophila, the green pitcher plant. Those will produce non-carnivorous leaves called phyllodia, and those serve to photosynthesize and produce energy for the plant through the winter. So definitely don't cut those ones off if you see them. Sundews can also go dormant. Sundews and butterworts, the cold temperate ones, like the ones from North America, like the cold temperate butterworts will often form a hibernicula, which is like a little, almost a bulb. It's just a little tiny reduced growth, and it'll look like the plant died all the way back. And sundews will do that as well. So most of these plants overall will tend to slow down and lose a lot of their leaves in the winter. Just make sure you're keeping them moist and you're giving them sun still. You don't want to put them in a dark area, and they should come back for you in the spring.
Great, thank you, Zach. Our next question, someone is looking for recommendations for repotting nepenthes. They would love information on maybe mediums, containers, or ways to keep the humidity up.
Yeah, so I'll address that humidity part first. And humidity is definitely important when growing nepenthes, but I found, especially in the household setting, the most important factor when growing your nepenthes is light. So making sure that they have a lot of light is going to keep the pitchers more than just trying to keep a lot of humidity. But going forward with that repotting part, I tend to use a denser mix in the house than I would in the greenhouse. So at home, I use a mix of sphagnum and perlite, about 75% sphagnum moss, not peat moss, but long fibered sphagnum moss. You can get it at a hardware store. It's generally used for orchid growing. And I also use 25% perlite. If you don't have the perlite, you can always just use the straight sphagnum moss, and that is a go-to for almost all carnivorous plants. But for Nepenthes in the home, they have fragile root systems, so when you're unpotting it, you want to make sure that you're not disturbing the roots that much. They're black and brittle and quite thin. They almost look like fern roots if you've ever grown a fern. And I tend to take the roots and spread them out over a ball of sphagnum moss like this, and then wrap them again, and then I take that sphagnum and push it into a pot. In the greenhouse, I use a little bit more well-draining mix, and instead of in the home where I grow them in just straight plastic containers, sometimes in the greenhouse I'll put them in plastic pots or net pots, depending on the species. But in a greenhouse, I just use a more well-draining mix, probably a little bit more perlite. If you don't have the perlite, again, straight sphagnum will generally work for you, but I prefer to have a little bit of perlite mixed in with mine. And in terms of humidity, it's not the most important factor, but it is good to give your Nepenthes a little bit more humidity. The first way you can do that is by putting them in a terrarium. I tend to not do this at home just to have easier access to my plants, but you can put them in an aquarium with grow lights, and that'll help the humidity raise a little bit. Or you can put them on trays of gravel. Generally, you don't want Nepenthes sitting in water for extended periods of time like other carnivorous plants, but putting them on a humidity tray with gravel will tend to help.
Great, thank you. Related to that, someone would love to start an indoor terrarium of carnivorous plants, and they'd like to know if they could use an old aquarium, and how would they perhaps go about starting this project?
Yeah, I mean, aquariums are great starting points for terrariums. I've definitely done it in the past. The first thing you want to consider is what type of plants do you want to grow? And there's lots of good candidates for terrarium growing indoors. The first one I might consider would be Nepenthes, some of the not dwarf species, but smaller growing species like Nepenthes glabrata, Nepenthes jamban. Those make wonderful candidates for growing in terrariums. They might eventually outgrow the terrarium, but you can always prune them and cut them back and take cuttings and make them smaller. The next thing you'd want to consider is how you're going to give this terrarium light. So an old aquarium is fine. You can just get a mesh top that you would get for a lizard. I used to have lots of reptiles, so I have a lot of those lying around the house. But you can put that on top, and I recommend getting LED grow lights now. Fluorescent lights are a bit old-fashioned, and they tend to generate a lot of heat. So if you can't afford the LED lights, they last much longer, and you rarely have to replace them. And that will provide enough light for growing things like Nepenthes. After that, you want to think about your substrate in the terrarium. I tend to put a false bottom, so that can be anything like pumice or leca or any washed stone to collect water at the bottom of the terrarium and make sure the plants aren't going to be soaking wet all of the time. And then you can put your media on top, and that can be anything you generally use to grow carnivorous plants, like sphagnum moss and perlite, or a mixture of peat moss and perlite, or even cocoa coir and orchid bark and perlite would be a nice mix as well. And you can go in there and decorate with little rocks and sticks and even other companion plants. And then you can plant your plants in there. And generally in the higher humidity, they'll tend to establish a bit quicker. And as long as they're getting water and light, you can make sure that they're growing. And lastly, I'd like to say with an aquarium, it's really nice because you can see the layers of false bottom and substrate in that aquarium. And you can make sure that your water is never going above that false bottom that you've installed to catch water. And that'll make sure your plants aren't sitting in water, because it can go stagnant in a terrarium pretty quickly. But the growing carnivorous plants in terrariums is great as long as you're using tropical plants that are going to outgrow those terrariums.
Wonderful. And someone is wondering about Nepenthes species that have large pitchers. If they're looking for specific species that have large pitchers, what are your recommendations?
If you're growing in the home, the first one that comes to mind would be Nepenthes truncata. And there's all kinds of forms of Nepenthes truncata. Generally, it's a lowland plant, which grows in really hot, humid conditions. But there are also highland species. There's one called Pasian red that does great in the house. I have a couple Nepenthes truncata at home, and they're very slow growers, but the pitchers eventually will get the entire size of your forearm. And they get quite large. So Nepenthes truncata would be one I would recommend. There's a whole complex of truncate Nepenthes with leaves that are blunt at the end, like Nepenthes truncata. And a couple of them are quite pricey. Ones like Nepenthes robcantlii is another wonderful species that I don't grow here in our greenhouses because it gets a bit too hot, but I do grow it at home. And that one is another very slow grower, but it will give you pitchers that are absolutely enormous and really rich, dark black and red. And I would recommend, if you can afford it, trying to find one of those as well. And lastly, a third recommendation, and this is probably the cheapest and most readily available of all these plants, would be Nepenthes ex Miranda. And that's an old hybrid Nepenthes. We have one in display in our adaptations house right now, actually. And it's generally a reliable grower in the home. It gets quite large, and the pitchers get anywhere from 8 inches to a foot at maturity. And it's a great Nepenthes to grow. It's a great starter plant as well. And you can find those often at local hardware stores. You can probably find them online as well, and they're very readily available.
Awesome. These are great recommendations. Someone is asking, they tried to grow a Venus flytrap from seed, but they never sprouted. They said they used distilled water. Any recommendations for starting Venus flytraps from seed?
Venus flytraps are super fun and super rewarding to grow from seeds. And I have a few at our production facility that I start from seed, just to see the diversity that shows up in the different seed. And I'll start by saying that's the wonderful part about growing these plants from seed, is you never know what you're going to get. You get all kinds of different colors, reds and greens and yellows that'll come up that are just quite different than buying a tissue cultured plant or one that's been propagated asexually. But if you're having issues with growing from seed, the first thing I would consider is your seed source. Venus flytraps produce seed generally in midsummer. And the seed will last for a while, but it doesn't last forever. So if you ordered your seed online, you want to make sure you're ordering it from a reputable source and that the seed was collected, hopefully in the year you're trying to grow it. And once you get it home, you don't want to wait 2 years and then plant it. You want to plant it as soon as you can. Venus flytraps, unlike some other temperate carnivorous plants, do not need a stratification. And stratification is a cold period that you would have to provide to seeds, like Sarracenia. So don't do that to your Venus flytrap seeds. They don't need that. So I would make sure you're getting fresh seeds. The next thing you would do, you can just sow those seeds on any carnivorous plant mix. I tend to sow them on a 50-50 mix of peat and perlite because it helps. The peat is a fine particle and the seeds won't fall down into the spaces between the particles in the soil. And then I just mist them with a mist bottle. You don't want to water them with a hose because it can displace the seeds. And then you can just put them in a plastic bag and they should germinate in about 2 weeks. And if you've done all those steps and they're not germinating, it's likely not your fault. The seed does degrade pretty quickly. So you want to make sure you're using seed that's fresh, and that is going to give you the highest success rate.
Awesome. Thank you, Zach. We've got another Venus flytrap question here. This person is from Wilmington, North Carolina, and they said they have observed endemic Venus flytraps growing in and around Sarracenia purpurea. Excuse me if you're better with the Latin name, Zach. And have you ever observed this interaction during your sampling in the Carolinas?
I have not witnessed Sarracenia purpurea with Venus flytraps or Dionea muscipula, but I would not be surprised if they were growing next to each other. When I went down there for the first time, I saw a Sarracenia flava there. So there's, these plants grow in very similar locations, so I wouldn't be surprised if they're growing there. And it's funny you mentioned Sarracenia purpurea, because that is actually one of the most widespread Sarracenia. It's native all the way down the East Coast and all the way up almost even into Canada. as well. And there's different subspecies of that. It's a very widespread Sarracenia. So I wouldn't be surprised if you saw them growing together. It would make sense. They generally prefer the same conditions in growing, and even in cultivation, they make great companion plants. So I would not be surprised at that at all.
Related to that, Zach, someone is looking for companion plants, good companion plants for Sarracenia. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, so most temperate carnivorous plants are wonderful companions, but there's also all kinds of other plants you can grow with your Sarracenia, like bog orchids like Pogonia and Calipogon make wonderful companion plants if you can find a source for those. There's all kinds of different bog lilies that will bloom and give you beautiful orange fiery flowers, as well as different ferns and carex, sedges that will grow well with Sarracenia. Generally, aside from the orchids, a lot of these plants are a bit faster growing than the Sarracenia, so you might have to divide and prune them out more often. But they make wonderful companion plants as long as you're keeping an eye on them and making sure they're not overgrowing your Sarracenia. Another great one to grow with Sarracenia is sphagnum moss. If you're growing carnivorous plants and you're not growing your own sphagnum moss yet, you're really missing out, because it will form these beautiful pillows of green fluffy moss all around your plants, and it just makes it look much more natural. And it's really a delight to see the plants growing with moss as they would in nature. And that's one of those ones. The moss does tend to grow quite fast, and you can have to sometimes pull it off of the plants and prune it back, but it's not too overwhelming. And that moss gives you a whole another world of things you can plant in there. You can plant all kinds of mini sundews, wintergreen, Gaultheria procumbens is another North American bog plant you can grow in there. All types of things will grow in that sphagnum along with your carnivores. So it's really great to mix them all together and have something beautiful. And you can really treat it. You don't really have to treat these as specimens. They make wonderful garden plants in bog gardens.
Awesome. Thank you, Zach. This person has a question about, what do we feed our Venus flytraps?
That's a great question. And feeding carnivorous plants, Venus flytraps, or all carnivorous plants, is analogous to fertilizing. So if you have plants at home, you've probably experienced fertilizing every so often. But carnivorous plants are from areas that have very low nutrients in the soil and in the water. So they really don't have the capacity to take up nutrients through their roots. So that's why they have evolved these strategies to capture and eat insects and other small animals. So if you're growing Venus flytraps and they're not outside, you do have to feed them. If your plants are outside, they will catch their own bugs. They've evolved for a very long time to do that, and you really don't have to worry about feeding them at all. If you want to feed your plants outdoors, you can always give them a mealworm or a live bug. Venus flytraps specifically do need to eat live prey. They've adapted to only catch moving insects, and they have these hairs on the leaves that once the traps close, they need to feel movement to actually seal shut and start digesting that bug. So don't feed your Venus flytrap bologna. Don't put people food in the traps. If you want to feed them, you have to capture a live bug and put it in there, or go to the pet store and buy some mealworms. If your plants are grown indoors, I don't recommend growing Venus flytraps indoors, but it can be done with some special considerations. But carnivorous plants in general indoors do need to be fed or fertilized. It's always fun to feed your plants. You can always just take like an osmocote pellet or fish food and drop them in the pitchers of your plants for like Nepenthes or South American pitcher plants. But the easiest way to do it is to fertilize your carnivorous plants. I recommend using Max C fertilizer. A lot of carnivorous plant growers use that fertilizer, and you can just mix it in with a quarter teaspoon per gallon of water and just spray it only on the foliage of your plants. And that will work for Venus flytraps too. Around once a month when they're actively growing is fine. But you want to make sure that they're getting the nutrients that they need to grow if they're not getting the insects that a plant outdoors would get.
Thank you, Zach. We've got a question here. Someone is saying that the traps on their Venus flytrap don't really close, and sometimes bugs will crawl in and out, and they won't close. So any recommendations for Venus flytraps that aren't closing?
Yeah, Venus flytraps can only open and close each trap about 3 times. So if you're touching them and you're making them open and close all the time, it's not really good for the plant. It's like giving food to your dog and taking it right away. It's kind of like tricking the plant. So don't do that. If you're doing that, stop. The plants don't really like it. The second thing, if they're not getting enough light, they're not going to have the energy they need to close the traps. Venus flytraps in shade will produce traps. They're just small and sometimes a little bit deformed. And generally they don't move as quickly. So if your plant is not getting enough light, that might be an issue as well. So first, stop poking them. If you are, I'm not saying that you are, but if you are, don't poke your traps and give the plant more light. That might help.
Great, thank you. Someone is wondering, they said that you are recommending not to keep your Venus flytraps or other carnivorous plants soaking wet, but they said that when they didn't do that, the sun wilted them and it seemed like their plants got weaker. Is there a trick to kind of finding the sweet spot between under and overwatered for these carnivorous plants?
Yeah, so I mean, in the summer, I do recommend keeping most of your carnivorous plants, aside from some of the Nepenthes and Mexican butterworts, soaking wet. If you're growing Venus flytraps or Sarracenia or sundews outdoors on a deck in full sun, they do need to be sitting in water, at least an inch of water at all times in the summer. You can also water in the way where you fill up your tray more than that and then let the tray dry out, not the plant, only the tray, and then fill it back up again. That always works. So I do recommend, if you're growing your plants outside in trays, to keep them filled when it's warm. Definitely do that. If you, in the winter though, generally these plants don't need as much water. They're not photosynthesizing as much. They're not pulling water through their leaves. They're not trapping as many insects. So the plants do still need to stay moist. But in the winter, I rarely water them because generally they don't dry out that much. You still need to be checking them and make sure that they are moist, but you don't want them to be soaking wet because they're not actively growing and that might rot them. A good analogy is most carnivorous plants want wet feet, not wet shoulders. So keep the roots wet, don't keep the rhizome wet, don't keep the bulb of the Venus flytrap wet, don't keep the water all the way up to the top of the pot, but make sure they are sitting in water at all times when they're actively growing.
Great, thank you. Someone is interested in designing their own bog. Do you have any recommendations for designing an outdoor area for carnivorous plants?
Yeah, I mean, you want to make sure that it's in a spot that gets full sun, first of all. You want to give these plants as much sun as you can. And you want to make sure it's in a spot that's a little bit protected from the cold if you live in a colder area. Generally, the plants that are buried in the ground are going to be more protected anyways, but as much protection as you can give them in the freezing temperatures of the winter is great. Then you want to choose a pond liner, something just black plastic pond liner works, and you want to fill your bog with a mix of 50-50 peat and sand. Generally, we try to stay away from peat moss here at the garden, and just in general in horticulture, most carnivorous plants are from peat bogs. So we really don't want to dig those bogs up and use it in horticulture because that kind of defeats the purpose of trying to conserve the plants. But there are special exceptions where we do use it for growing carnivorous plants. So you want to use that for your bogs because they will prefer to grow in that mix. And then you just want to pick your plants, pick the plants that you like. As long as you're picking cold temperate plants, you really can't go wrong. And lastly, once you have your main Sarracenia and Venus flytraps in there, if you grow other carnivorous plants like Cape sundews indoors or even other tropical sundews, you can always sprinkle seeds in there in the early spring, and that will cause your garden to fill with those things in the summer. They'll die off in the winter, but it's nice to have little annual carnivorous plants and volunteers pop up in the garden. I always like seeing little tiny things growing in the garden mixed in with the bigger plants. But really, I find that the mistake people make the most when designing gardens is they're not filling them with enough plants. You want them to look full, you want them to look lush. So give your plants space. And if you have to divide them in a few years, you just have more plants to grow. So that's not really bad in my opinion, but make sure they look full and lush. And you really can't go wrong as long as you're using rain or RO water to water your bog and putting it in a sunny spot that always stays wet.
Wonderful. This person is wondering, they're having issues kind of mimicking dormancy for their plants. They're saying that they're putting them in the fridge for 3 months, December through February, and that they're watering them once a week while they're in the fridge. Do you have any recommendations for this person?
Yeah, I actually used to use the fridge method, and it's when I lived in an apartment without outdoors, I would put my Venus flytraps in the fridge in the winter, and it's a great way to keep them dormant as long as you follow a couple steps. The first is you don't want to put it in the fridge before the plant is showing signs of dormancy. So you need to get that plant to start to go dormant, or else it's probably going to die on you and rot. There's a couple precautions you need to take when putting your plants in the fridge. The first is making sure the plants are starting to go dormant, so giving them less light and putting them on a cold windowsill will help with that. Once they start to go dormant, you should unpot your plants, whether it be a Venus flytrap or a Sarracenia, and I wrap them in a paper towel. Before I do that, though, I'll spray them with like a sulfur fungicide because fungus might rot out your plants. It's a stressful process on the plant, unpotting it and sticking it in a fridge. It's not very nice to the plants, but it's good for them in the long run, so definitely do it. But I've treated with a garden safe sulfur fungicide, one that's safe on food, and you want to make sure you're putting them in a spot in a fridge in the garage or somewhere where your food isn't going to be if you're taking that step. And if you're using your main refrigerator where you're putting your food, maybe don't spray pesticides on your plants because that might be a bad idea. But make sure you're reading the label and following the instructions on that. But I've generally treated my plants with that sulfur fungicide before I put them in the fridge. I next will wrap them in a paper towel with a little bit of damp sphagnum moss. Make sure it's damp, not soaking wet, just a little bit damp. And I wrap them up and I wrap them in a paper towel and put them in a plastic bag. And on that plastic bag, I make sure I label the plant and put the exact date I put it in the fridge so I know what it is and how long it's been in there for when I need to take it out and pot them up. And lastly, I don't really water them. I'll check on them a couple times through the winter. I haven't done this in a while, but when I used to do it, they generally stay moist in the fridge, especially if they're in a plastic bag. So don't give your plant water unless it's starting to dry out. Keep them moist, again, not dry, but just moist, just slight damp to the touch. And in 3 months, you can take them out of the fridge and pot them up in whatever carnivorous plant media you use, and they'll start actively growing again. If you follow those steps, everything should go well. I will say it's better if you can give them an outdoor dormancy, but if you can't, it's another great method to do it. But just make sure you're not forgetting about your plants in the fridge, and if you're using fungicide, that you're not putting it near your food or anything that you would be eating.
Thank you, Zach. We've got someone who's wondering if they are starting an indoor terrarium for carnivorous plants, how long do you recommend leaving an LED light on for? 12 hours on, 12 hours off?
It depends on how bright your light is and what plants you're growing. If you're growing plants that seasonally slow down, you might want to give them less light in the winter. But I leave my grow lights on at home for about 12 hours. If your terrarium is getting natural sunlight for a portion of the day, you don't need to give it light at that point of the day if it's getting direct sun through a window, so you can do that. But you should definitely check how bright your lights are. If you have a light meter, the intensity of the light was given when you bought the grow lights, but generally 12 hours isn't really going to hurt anything. So most of the plants you're growing in terrariums are tropical and would definitely appreciate that much light.
Wonderful. And someone is wondering, they've got, it sounds like they've got pitcher plants outside and the pitchers flop over and the tops start turning brown. Is it okay to cut the pictures that flop over?
Yeah, as long as you're not taking too many pictures off the plant, gardening, in my opinion, should be for your own enjoyment. And if there's a part of the plant that you don't want to look at, you can cut it off. It's not going to hurt the plant as long as you don't go scissor crazy and cut everything off. Sometimes I cut off a little bit more than I should, but I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. But if there's a part of the plant that you don't want to see, definitely cut it off. If it's browning, you can cut that part off. Some people will leave the green part of the picture there if there's insects in it, because the plant will continue to digest that. But you can definitely cut the brown off. To keep the pictures from flopping over, make sure you're giving them a lot of light. They'll grow stronger and more upright in full sun. And you can also use peony cages, are wonderful for Sarracenia. If you put them on the pot before the plant is actively growing in the spring, you can have the Sarracenia grow through the peony cage, and then they're not going to fall over. If you can't find peony cages, you can always just use a few stakes with some string wrapped around it, and that will keep the plants upright through the growing season, and you won't really notice it. But I've noticed in rain and strong wind, Sarracenia are going to fall over at some point. So doing as much as you can with staking and peony cages is going to help through the growing season.
Great, thanks, Zach. The last question here is someone is just looking for, generally, we've talked about this a little bit, but what kind of mediums do you recommend for growing carnivorous plants?
You really have to consider what types of plants you're growing. There's all different types of carnivorous plant media, and everyone has their own opinion. But most carnivorous plant growers will agree that a 50% mix of peat moss and perlite is a wonderful mix for carnivorous plants. So I would say research the plant that you are growing and make a mix based on that plant. Nepenthes are going to want different mix than Pinguicula, but I wouldn't be surprised if they grew in the same mix. They might just do better in a mix specially tailored to them. But the most important thing when you're growing carnivorous plants and making media is to use products that are organic and have no added fertilizers. If you buy a product that has added fertilizer, like some of the peat moss you'll find in the hardware store, like perlite and peat moss, but if you use those products, it will burn the roots of your plants and they'll slowly start to die. So make sure you're buying organic products with no added fertilizer, and that you're creating a mix that's specially for the type of carnivorous plants you want to grow.
Great. Thank you so much, Zach, for sharing your expertise today. And thank you everyone who joined us to hear all this great information about carnivorous plants.